Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second prospective candidates and agents briefing for the local election taking place on the 5th of May 2022. My name is Tracy Hurst. For those of you who don't know me, I'll be leading the presentation this evening, and here with me I have Zoe Armstrong as part of the team and Elaine Newsome. And we'll be covering any questions at the end if there's any questions anybody have got. So just some introductions in terms of our leadership team. So for this election, the returning officer is the current interim chief executive, who is Kim Bromley-Derry, and Kim, in his capacity as returning officer, has appointed myself, Zoe, Elaine and Sergey Tor as deputy returning officers in terms of delivery of this election. So that's some introductions for everybody. Just some housekeeping points before we start. So this session will be recorded. The purpose of that is that we can then send that out to you to aid any questions and give you some support in terms of completing your nomination papers for this election and any points that you need to clarify. We will have a question section at the end, but if you have questions as we go along or you'd like to clarify any points, please put your questions in the chat box and we can go through those at the end. Okay, so this briefing, the pre-nominations briefing, the start of the election, the objective is for us to give you and provide you with some key points relating to how you stand for election, how you stand as a candidate for election. I'm sure that on the call tonight we've probably got candidates and agents that have gone through this process before, and we may have new candidates and agents that haven't gone through this process before. So it's really important that what we cover is as detailed and we approach it as if it would be anybody that hasn't gone through this process before, so we can make sure we give them all the information. So what we cover, so we'll cover some information about registration and about absent votes in terms of the electorate and how you can help people register and encourage people to register. Key timetable dates for our registration deadlines, but also for yourselves as candidates and what those key dates are. Guidance on completing your nomination form. So the critical part of this stage of your process is the completion of your nomination forms to stand. So this briefing concentrates quite heavily on how we should and how those forms should be completed. We'll touch on your agents and some issues around campaigning and the integrity of the election. Some brief information about the day of poll and candidates' expenses. The next steps around what happens next is there will be a subsequent briefing following this one, which will deal in some of these elements in more detail once nominations have closed. But as I say, primarily today, the objective is for us to be able to concentrate on the submission of your nomination forms. Okay, so in terms of electoral registration, as yourselves as candidates, as part of that campaigning process, you're kind of in a unique position to be able to have discussions with the electorate, encourage them to vote and register to vote. Sorry, you should encourage that as soon as possible. The deadline there is Thursday, the 14th of April that we've mentioned. It's really quick and simple for electors to register to vote. The use of the online system is very quick and very easy. They just need that personal information, their date of birth and their national insurance number. So that process, we would ask, we know when you are speaking to our electors and residents of the borough, that, you know, just to encourage them to, if they're not registered, to register as soon as possible. And in terms of absent votes, the two-stage process around that is an elector has to be registered first before they can apply for an absent vote. So in those conversations, it's really important that if you come across electors that wish to have an absent vote, that they actually have gone through that registration process first. So if you could mention that, you know, as part of the process, that would be helpful. You can contact us at the elections office. We will send out forms direct to electors that wish to apply for an absent vote. We can pre-print those forms and send those out. And then once we've received those, we can process those and register them to receive a postal pack. Just a quick mention there around the code of conduct for campaigners. I'll follow that up shortly on a subsequent slide. But just be mindful of how you're handling absent vote applications. It's good practice for you not to be handling volumes of absent vote applications, and just be mindful of that. You know, we're here to help with any inquiries around that you've got. I have put on the right hand side of this slide a quick note to say when we're issuing our postal ballot papers, so our registered postal voters, it's approximately 27,000 of them that we've got registered in Sandwell, and the first issue of those votes will be going out on Thursday the 14th of April. So we have got Easter in between our election timetable this year, so that changes things slightly. Pick that day, so Thursday following the visit, the officers will make to the printers to physically check and audit check our postal votes. They will be dispatched on Thursday, so they will start to land on mats of our electors around Saturday onwards. And then the second issue of postal votes, following the deadline, the second tranche that we send out will be Friday the 22nd of April. Okay. So if we look at the deadlines, then the legal critical deadlines that we apply to registration, in the first instance, you'll see here we've listed all of the key deadlines in terms of registering to vote, for people to apply to vote by post, to change their arrangements. If somebody's a current postal voter and they wish to change their status to a proxy voter, the deadline for them to do that would be the same day, so 5 p.m. Tuesday the 19th of April. New proxy votes, so if anybody wishes to apply to vote by proxy for this election, then the deadline for that is Tuesday the 26th of April. New applications to vote by proxy, so a medical emergency or emergency proxies, they can be applied for up until 5 p.m. On actual polling day, so actually on Thursday the 5th of May. And the legislation that surrounded the provision for emergency proxies for people that were tested positive or were self-isolating with COVID, that still applies to this election. So we've had confirmation that that's the case. The postal votes that we issue, there is a legal date in which we are not allowed to issue a replacement, and the first date that applies is Thursday the 28th of April, and if electors have not received their postal vote, then they get until Thursday the 5th of May at 5 p.m. to be able to register and request a replacement for that postal vote. So they're the key dates around our legislation timetable. So for yourselves as candidates, the key dates for you, we kick off with the notice of election, which will be Friday the 25th. That starts the nomination process, and it starts the pre-election process. And within the election timetable, we can commence nominations at that point, and we will conduct those nomination appointments from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. On a daily basis. So that starts our process. We continue that process until 4 o'clock on Tuesday the 5th of April. So Tuesday the 5th is our deadline for nominations. So all of your critical documents and the documents that are required by law to be submitted, we must receive those by the deadline at 4 p.m. And if anybody wish to withdraw their position as a candidate, which you are entitled to do. So if you stood to stand as a candidate in more than one area, for example, if you hadn't withdrawn from those areas by the deadline of close of nominations, then you wouldn't essentially be able to stand in any of them. So please be really clear about how the rules are applied around that. Election agent, so to assist you with your campaign, to assist you with standing as a candidate, you can appoint an election agent, and there is a required form by law that we need, which is contained within your nomination pack, that also has to be submitted to us by 4 p.m. on the 5th of April. Now, the publication of the statement of persons nominated. So we publish a statement, a legal document, which states what candidates have been nominated to stand in a particular ward. Now, there is a legal deadline for us to actually publish that form, and that is Wednesday, the 6th of April. But what we tend to do, and for those of you that are involved in this process before, we try and publish that statement as soon as practically possible after the close of nominations. So the close of nominations on the 4th, once we're satisfied that everything's ready to be published and correct, then we aim to publish that as soon as possible. So in terms of your supporting agents, yes, you can have your election agent. You can also appoint counting and polling agents. So those agents, that is an official appointment in writing, and there's a deadline for those agents to be appointed, which is the 27th of April. Your election expenses, your election agent is the person responsible for the conduct of your election expenses and the submission of them. And there is a deadline for that, and that is a legal deadline. So that's Thursday, the 9th of June for your election expenses. Okay, so just to give you some information around how Sandwell is approaching COVID-19 this year in terms of restrictions. For those people that were involved last May, you would have been familiar, we were in a very different position, and there were various mitigations and quite robust measures that were put into place for the last elections. We're in a very different position now. Legal restrictions have been lifted, and on the back of that, we still need to be mindful that people have to be kept safe. So our approach to this election for all of our electoral events, and this includes nominations, would be that we would encourage and advise people. So we would advise you to wear a face covering, we would have them available, we would advise you to exercise good hand hygiene. We also would advise that you undertake a rapid flow test prior to attending your electoral events. And I think one of the key things is that if you are unwell in any way or suffering with symptoms from COVID-19 or tested positive, we would advise you to stay away from our electoral events on that basis. So the principle around how we and the approach this year is just for us to give you that encouragement and recommend you to use some mitigations, but the legal restrictions around social distancing, the use of screens that we used last time, will not be in place for this election, subject to hopefully that there's no change to the position in terms of the pandemic. Okay, so standing for election, so actually submitting your forms to stand as a candidate. So in order to meet that requirement, there are several things that you as an individual have to satisfy. There's several qualifications. So you need to be 18 years of age, as it's stated on this slide. You need to be a British Commonwealth citizen, but also in addition to that, those 4 registered qualifications that are listed there needs to be one of those that apply. And if all of them apply to yourself as a candidate, then we always advise electors to, we always advise candidates and agents to mark as many that apply. But that is the basic requirements for you in terms of your qualifications. We'll touch on this in a bit more detail in some subsequent slides. So there are qualifications you need to meet, and there are disqualifications associated with standing as a candidate. Now, the full list of disqualifications are lengthy, and we always advise candidates and agents that if you are in any doubt as to whether you could potentially be disqualified, it's absolutely critical that you seek some advice around that. Use the information that's available to you from the Electoral Commission and the guidance for candidates to ensure that you are actually not disqualified for standing. Nomination documents are legal documents, and with that, potentially any false statements on nomination papers are subject to criminal proceedings. So it's absolutely critical you satisfy yourself that you do not, that you are aware of what the disqualifications are and that you meet that. In terms of the returning officer would not be able to confirm whether you as a candidate are disqualified. And again, just to reiterate, please seek legal advice if you need further assistance with that. So those are your qualifications and the disqualifications. So actually submitting your nomination papers. Now, the submission of nomination papers also form part of a very legal framework. So they have to be submitted by hand. So your nomination form, your consent to nomination form, your home address form, those 3 documents must be submitted by hand and be received by the deadline for close of nominations. If you're standing on behalf of a political party, then the 2 other documents that form part of that nomination pack would be certificate of authorisation, and they would be the authorisation to use an emblem. Now, whilst we need to receive those documents by the deadline for close of nominations, with those documents they can be submitted by the post. It doesn't specify in law that they have to be by hand. But what I would say to any candidate and agent that's submitting your forms, please submit all these forms together, because what that does is mitigate any issues around perhaps the potential form not being received, or any confusion as to whether the whole pack has been received. In terms of protecting yourselves and in terms of good practice, I would always advise you to submit all those forms together. So in terms of you submitting your actual nomination forms, from the 25th of March until the 5th of April is the window for you, between 10 and 4. We will operate the receipt of nominations from Oldbury Council House, and we will do that in the committee rooms. We have 2 committee rooms available. Please make sure that your nomination forms are filled in correctly, because they are legal documents, and it's your responsibility to ensure that they're submitted by the deadline and as they should be. We can arrange informal checks. Now, last year, one of the implementations we made was around COVID, was that what we would actually do is we would conduct online informal checks for candidates and agents, and that actually proved really positive, and we had some really good feedback around that. So regardless of the COVID position, we are still continuing to do that. So we can conduct online checks for you, we can have Teams calls, we can go through your nomination papers and support you and check them and give you any information or advice that you need. And please take advantage of that service that we can give you. To arrange that, you can contact Zoe or myself or Electoral Services, and we'll make an appointment for an online. If you prefer to have a face-to-face informal check, again, we'll adopt a blended approach this year, so you can have a face-to-face appointment with us as well if you prefer that. And that slide again just reiterates the forms that need to be delivered to the room specified, which we will specify on the notice of election, because that avoids any confusion as to whether a form and a nomination form has been delivered or not. So we'll make that as strict as possible in terms of its delivery destination. An original version of each completed document must be submitted. We can't accept copies of any nomination forms. Everything has to be an original document. So some important information just before we go on to do what I've put into the briefing this time is just some pictorial slides around looking at the forms, so we can highlight some key points. But just some key points I wanted to touch on first. So the candidate's responsibility. As a candidate, you are responsible for the submission of your nomination paper. You're responsible for ensuring what you submit is correct and that it meets the requirement of law. The change last year to the subscribers for COVID has now been amended and reverted back to 10 subscribers to support your nomination paper. So you will need a proposer and a seconder and 8 other subscribers for this year's election. The returning officer, for those of you that haven't been involved in elections before, I just wanted to reiterate the position of the returning officer and how that works. The returning officer is a separate independent function to Sandwell Council. Kim, in his capacity, has been appointed as returning officer for Sandwell Council, but that appointment is a completely separate appointment. So what that means is, in terms of your nomination papers and what is submitted to us, there's no powers of investigation from the returning officer's perspective. What we receive on your nomination paper, we as deputies, Zoe and I, we receive your form, we are checking that form to check that it meets the requirements by law. So has it been completed as the law says it needs to be? And we look at that nomination paper on its face, and that's how we check it. There are no powers of investigation into the information contained in that nomination form. So just to, I'm raising that just to make people aware that once we have determined a nomination form, once we have deemed it as being valid, any challenge to the information that is contained within that nomination form can only be done through a legal challenge after the election. So, you know, the information that you present on your form, we'll check it meets the requirements by law. We would not conduct any further investigation checks as to what's contained in your paper. And I think it's important for us to make clear that the returning officer is a completely independent, separate function to the council. So completing your nomination forms then. So if we look at the first form, nomination, Form A. I'll go on to a pictorial guide to this, but if we just look at the first section, you need to include your full name on the top of the section. You have the option for a commonly used name. Now, this is one of the common areas when we look at nomination papers that there's sometimes some confusion about how commonly used names work. Essentially, what you cannot do in terms of a commonly used name is use it to enable you to stop the use of a middle name. So what we're saying is that a commonly used name must be different. It must be different to that of your first name. So we use an example many times, say for Andrew John Smith. So Andrew John Smith has a commonly used name of Andy. So on the basis of that, Andy would be his commonly used name and Smith would be his surname. So on the statements of persons nominated, on the notice of poll, which is a legal statutory document we publish, and also on the ballot papers, his commonly used name would be Andy Smith. But any commonly used names that are used, it's really important that candidates are aware that your full name needs to be printed on any expenses returns that you make, but also on any of your campaign material. So if anyone is using a commonly used name, their campaign material must specify their full name. So it's just important to be aware of that. Now, if you completed the use of a commonly used name and it wasn't in accordance with how the guidance says it should be completed, we can't invalidate your paper. So that wouldn't invalidate your nomination. But what Zoe or I would do is point out to you as a candidate that potentially if it isn't as in accordance as it should be, then you could be challenged afterwards. And we would make that clear to you. But ultimately, we can't invalidate your paper on that basis. The first part of the nomination form also has the description field. So there's 3 entries that can be put in that description field. It can be left blank, it can be independent that's stated on there, and party candidates with the authorisation can use their party name or any of the registered descriptions that's registered with the Electoral Commission. And we submit or we check with the Electoral Commission that the parties that are registered, and also that your certificate is issued on behalf of the nominating officer for that party. So it's please make sure that anything that needs to be checked with the Electoral Commission, you do so before you submit your papers. So on this slide, we've got a nomination paper and we've got a certificate of authorisation that we're showing you. And what I wanted to do with this slide is just point out to you that top section of the form where it says the Mercedes Party. So Mercedes Party is in the description. So John James Smith is standing for the Mercedes Party. On the right-hand side, on the certificate of authorisation, you'll see that exact wording is what it says on the certificate of authorisation. That's one of the things that we will check when you submit your papers. It's really important that what is detailed on the certificate of authorisation, signed by the nominating officer, matches exactly the description that's on your nomination paper. Because essentially, if it was different, what we're saying is that you haven't got a description that's been supported by the political party for you to use. So it's just kind of to emphasise and point out that 2 pieces of information really need to be the same. And you'll see from the nomination form that the full name is completed, the elector numbers, a signature and a name is printed, and that the that the nominating officer signed the certificate of authorisation. So it's just kind of a pictorial image just to try and make it clearer for people and highlight those key points. The second part, kind of the nomination. So nomination form, the second slide around this is to confirm that your 10 subscribers are required. Now what we've done here is split this nomination form into kind of 3 parts. And what we would say is that number 1, so section number 1 on here, we would always say to any candidate and agent that you must get 2 and 3 completed after you've got number one. That number one must be completed before you ask any subscribers to sign your nomination paper. And again, that's something that, you know, we would pick out and would actually invalidate your paper if it hadn't been completed correctly or if any of that information was missing. So the section in number one is where you're stating who you are as a candidate, and if you're standing for a political party, what that political party is. So it's really important that that information is completed before you ask any electors to sign your form. So I thought by breaking it down into kind of, to give you a more visual element of it, it may ease that process. The register that you will use, that you can be provided with, and we'll touch on the access to the register shortly, is the March register that you will use. I've mentioned here data protection requirements. Please ensure when you are having those discussions with electors and the residents in the borough that they are aware, and that you are aware as candidates, of any requirements around GDPR and what that means. Subscribers need to be aware of what their personal information is being used for. That is covered in all of your candidates and agents guidance that the Electoral Commission published for you, but it's just to highlight those points for you. Just another point on your subscribers, just so you're aware, in Sandwell we've got 24 wards that have got elections this year. There's one seat in all of those wards, so there's one vacancy. So so a subscriber can only sign one nomination paper. They can only sign a paper based on the number of vacancies that are available. So it's just to bear that in mind. We have robust mechanisms in place to check that a subscriber hasn't signed more nomination papers than they should, but just so you're aware of candidates and agents that's how it's meant to work. So this is an addition over the last couple of years, which is the home address form. So the home address form was introduced to remove the candidate's home address from the nomination paper. So what it does, it provides you the opportunity to specify that you do not want your home address to be printed on the ballot paper. It's a form that must be delivered by hand, must be completed correctly, and it must be delivered to us by the deadline. And one of the key things around the home address form is that the witness that actually signs, it has to be the same person that signed your consent to nomination. And again, I've got a comparison of those two forms so we can show you and kind of give you a visual display of how that should be. The home address form is split into two parts. So part one of the home address form is where you put your full name and your home address. You also put any qualifying addresses. So the list of the qualifications that form A, B, C or D that you'll see on your consent to nomination and on your home address form, you need to mark on that form what qualifications you are using and mark the addresses that relates to. There needs to be the full name and the home address of the witness on that part one of the home address form, which is the person that signed your consent to nomination. And I've just put a point there to say that the qualifications marked on your consent must match the ones on your home address form, just as a reminder. And we've got a kind of pictorial slide coming up for that. Section 2 of the home address form. Now, this is the section that candidates would complete if you didn't want your address to go on the ballot paper. So if you didn't want that to happen, you would need to sign it, and it would need to state that the area, the relevant area, and the relevant area for this election is Sandwell. So you would put that, and that's what would be printed on the ballot paper. So if you do not want your address to be printed on the ballot paper, section 2 of that form needs to be completed. Okay, so what we've got here is the pictorial guide of the consent to nomination and the home address form. And as you'll see on here, if we go kind of from top to bottom, there's the section for the full name and for the ward and the area that this election applies to. And then there's a list of qualifications. So you can see here in this example that actually Mr. John James Smith is using C in terms of his qualification to stand. And that's what matches his home address form, and he's put in all of the relevant addresses that apply to that qualification. Now, this is something again that we will check as part of your informal check We can check that this is as it should be. You'll notice at the bottom of the consent form, Michael Mouse has witnessed that. And he's put his full name, and then on the home address form, Michael Mouse has actually put his full name and his address. So there you can see that that's a correlation between the two forms, and that we need that information to match. So hopefully, with it being a bit more pictorial, it's easier to see that that's the case. Okay, your consent to nomination form. So we've gone through the nomination, we've gone through the home address form. So this is the third form in terms of your nomination pack, which is the consent to nomination. You must complete this in full with all the information, the ward that you're standing in, and strike through the qualifications that don't apply. Again, as many qualifications that do apply, always put those on the form. We would always advise you to do that. And you've got your witness name and signature. Now, our nomination packs on our website, there is a link to the pack in this presentation as well. They do contain the submission of Section 80. So the Section 80 of the Local Government Act and the Section 34 of the Localism Act, they all form part of your consent to nomination. So if you submitted a nomination paper with just your consent form, without that legal guidance attached with that, that isn't your actual proper consent to nomination. And again, that's something that we would highlight if that we received a nomination paper and it wasn't contained as part of that informal check. So please ensure that you use one of our nomination packs, the electoral commission packs, detail this information and have the legislation contained in it. So that's really important, because that isn't classed as a full consent if we don't have that information. So the certificate of authorisation, we've mentioned this. So if you're standing on behalf of a political party, we need to receive this. It can be posted, but again, I would stress, please submit it at the same time as you're submitting all of your other forms. It allows you to use the party name or a registered description. And again, the deadline must be submitted by 4 p.m. on the 5th of April. Joint candidates. So joint candidates, they can be nominated by more than one party. If that's the case, a registered description can be used, but what we will require is a certificate of authorisation which is signed for both parties for that. So there is one emblem that can be used, but we would need both certificates of authorisation to support the nomination for each political party. But again, more detailed information is contained within the EC guidance around that, but that's just to give you the key points. Okay, so we've touched on the nomination forms. So if we look now at your election agent, critical part of your process for this, critical support in terms of how you are exercising your campaign. So they're responsible for the proper management of your election campaign, particularly your financial management, of which we touched on previously. They're responsible for managing your expenses. We need to receive details of that appointment, as mentioned previously, by 4 p.m. on the 5th of April, and we do include the form in the nomination pack. Now, if you didn't appoint an agent, you would be deemed your own agent by default, which is fine, and you would be specified as your own election agent. But what we always point out to candidates is that if that is the case, even if you have submitted on your home address form that you do not want your address to be made public, if you are deemed your own agent and you haven't appointed one, and that agent's address that's being used is your home address, then that will result in being publicised on the statement of election agents, the notice of election agents, which will be published on the website. So that's just one of the kind of quirky elements of the law around how that works. So it's important that you're aware of that. So we would again point this out to you and make it clear to you that was the case. But it's just good to emphasise that. Alongside your election agent, you can appoint other agents to support you in this process. So you can appoint agents to attend polling stations, and you can appoint agents to support you at the count venue. We require that appointment in writing. Again, it's a legal process and we need it by the deadline. Appointment for postal vote agents, you can have people that attend postal vote sessions whereby they can come and view for you the process that's happening with postal votes. We need to receive that notification prior to the session. So, and if we were going to change any of those sessions, we would need to give you 48 hours notice as candidates to make sure that you're aware of that change. Following this briefing, for those of you that have done this before, you'll be aware we send you quite a detailed email with lots of different links and supporting information. So anything that's mentioned here, don't worry, in terms of forms, you will be sent access to all of this to support you. And so you can see where everything's accessible for you to be able to get those forms. I've mentioned this previously around access to electoral registers and absent vote lists. Now, the electoral register, as electoral registration officer, the person responsible for maintaining that register, you are able to have access to that register as a candidate to assist you with standing for election, but it is only for those permitted purposes. So you're allowed to use it to assist you with completing your nomination form, to help you campaign and to check any donations. So they're your permitted purposes that you can use that information for. It's personal data, so all of what comes with that and how you how you protect that information is really important. So you can have access to it, but there are deadlines and there is a specific legal time as to when as a candidate you can. Now, just to mention in there, it does say it on the slide, independent candidates, we cannot supply you with a digital register if you haven't registered with the ICO. So that's one of the new that came in with the GDPR regulations. So any independent candidate, if they'd like to receive a digital register, must be registered with the ICO. So just remember that, but they can receive a paper copy. So access. So when you officially become a candidate, now anybody can declare themselves a candidate at any time throughout this process, but there is a legal date that you actually officially become a candidate, and that is the date in which you are entitled to the register. So that date is Monday the 28th of March. Now, for political parties, there is a regulation that allows political parties to have access to electoral registers. So it may be that a political party could actually get access to a register prior to that date. But what we do say is that in terms of independent candidates to assist with the nomination process, we can look at elector numbers and to provide some information if they've got, if they want elector numbers to be checked over the phone, but if it's prior to that date. But the 28th is the official date when access to those registers is allowed, and that applies to the absent voting lists as well. So our proposed postal vote opening sessions. So for the local election last year, to assist us with COVID, we moved to a different venue to allow adequate social distancing. This year we will be conducting our postal vote sessions back at Oldbury Council House in the council chamber. And the details of the dates are detailed on this slide for you. Just a couple of points to highlight. The slitting of the postal votes will take place on Wednesday, the 20th of April. And when we slit the postal votes, they are actually being opened. So you're entitled to observe that process if you wish. Then the full list of dates are there. And just to highlight to you that on the session 8 and 9, we will be conducting those sessions from Tipton Sports Academy. And those last sessions will take place during polling day and then at the last session from 8 PM until we finish the count at Tipton Sports Academy. So there aren't any restrictions in terms of numbers of observers this time for these events, but obviously we need to be mindful of excessive numbers. So your appointment of your postal vote agents, we can, if absolutely they can attend with you. Last year there were strict limits. It was only a candidate and an agent that could do this. So there is more options and flexibility this year with the lifting of restrictions. The integrity of the election. So fundamentally what underpins this whole process around delivering democracy is protecting the integrity of the election. And for the returning officer, obviously that's paramount for us to do that. So in terms of your campaign, it's your responsibility that as part of that campaign, you'll also adhere to all the guidance and all the information that's provided to you to ensure that you are also protecting the integrity of that system. So we've got some points here about campaigning do's and don'ts. Now, the detail around campaigning and the code of conduct is quite extensive. The Electoral Commission guidance is very detailed around how that works, but please ensure that yourself or your election agent familiarises themselves with the real specifics around this, because again, some instances there are electoral offences associated with this, so it's really important that you're aware of that. Imprints, it's a common issue around campaign material. You need to ensure that your imprints, including any social digital imprints that are being material that's being publicised, has got your printed and published by imprint on it. That's critically important. There are specifics around the Highways Code of Practice, which we've publicised on our website. The returning officer, in agreement with Sandwell Council, has come up and we have this code of practice that's in place in terms of highways. Please familiarise yourself with that. It's important that you're aware of the implications around that. Please do not produce anything that looks like a poll card, because what we don't want to be doing is be seen to be misleading electors in any way and causing confusion around the process. And it states there about paying people to display the adverts unless that they're displayed as part of their normal business. So there's just some key points there around campaigning do's and don'ts. And then I've touched here, next couple of slides talks about the code of conduct for campaigning. So the code of conduct for campaigning is around the electoral registration side of things and the absent vote applications, which I've mentioned slightly at the beginning of this session. So it's really important that when you are speaking to the residents within the borough, that you encourage people to speak to us around any requirements that they have. Applications for postal votes, registration applications, if you've got those, we would advise that you get those to us within 2 working days if you could. We can always, as I've said, send out information to people, and then it mentions about postal ballot packs, and the following slide details that a bit around postal ballot packs and how we should be operating them. So there's application forms to vote by post, and there's the actual postal ballot pack. So when we've sent those out, the code of conduct for campaigners is really clear that we should never be touching another elector's postal ballot pack. That there shouldn't be a presence around when people are completing them, because the intention is that the secrecy of the ballot is maintained at all time, and never handle the postal packs or a completed postal pack from voters. Just encourage them to use the processes that are in place for them to return it. And then you've got campaigning outside of polling stations. So essentially what we're saying here is the code of conduct is there to protect yourselves and also protect voters, to ensure that what's not happening outside polling stations is impacting on the voters' process. For us as a returning officer, our absolute priority is to ensure that electors have got easy access to polling stations where they're able to enter and exit without any form of issues or being impeded anyway. So this code of conduct is there to protect that and ensure that the electors have easy access to our polling stations to conduct their vote. What we will have at the next briefing following the close of nominations, with West Midlands Police, our special point of contact for elections, will be attending the briefing, so they can also talk about campaigning and election reporting, any election complaints, and they can talk in more detail around that and support our briefings that we do next time. So our approach to this in terms of election complaints, and what we have done is across the West Midlands with the other West Midlands local authorities and the West Midlands Police, we have a process that's been agreed of how we report allegations of electoral fraud, election complaints or election malpractice. So there is a malpractice reporting form that is available on our website, and we would advise candidates and agents that if there is any alleged complaints to be made, that form is utilised and completed as fully as possible, and we would ask that as much information can be submitted, and that's submitted to ourselves at the elections team, myself or Zoe. If you send that through to us, we can ensure that reaches the special point of contact at West Midlands Police. where they will actually pick up and then deal and take that forward and deal with any election complaints. So that form is available to use. It's available on the website. So please, ensure that you've got access to that form should it be necessary. Information is critical around that. The SPOC has talked to us about how important it is if they are going to receive an allegation or an alleged complaint, that the critical point is that they get as much information as possible that surrounds that. Just to finish, in terms of maintaining the integrity of the election, and also around elements of your campaign associated with that, we've been asked, a voluntary organisation contacted the council. I think they're contacting all councils, just for us to use this opportunity to make it really clear to candidates and agents that there are some voluntary organisations and that are completely independent to the police. And this particular one contacted us and asked if we could communicate as via our briefings, which is the West Midlands Neighbourhood Watch force area group. They are a completely a separate group to the police. It's a voluntary organisation. So when you are, in terms of your campaign material, in terms of any connections to any local groups, etc., can we just please be aware, because these groups are apolitical and completely in kind of a non-partisan role in that sense. So if you could just be mindful around that and check any of these organisations prior to any campaign material being associated or being in connection with them. Okay, so polling day. So polling day itself, we've just put a slide here just to say, what we will be doing in polling stations is we, like everywhere now, we will be reducing the risk. We want to reduce the risk of the spread and of people catching COVID-19. So we will be encouraging and recommending the use of face coverings and exercising good hand hygiene. All of that will be available within polling stations. We would, like I said previously, advise people not to attend if they're unwell. Pencils will be available for electors. We will make sure that we've got pencils available if they wish to use a separate pencil, and also if they want to bring their own, that's completely fine as well. In terms of polling stations, we've had a number of changes for this election. We've took a review out of the schools that we used for polling stations with a view to try and reduce the number of schools we used, and there will be a number of changes on polling day. What we've got in place is several mitigations that we're putting in place to make sure electors are very aware of those changes. But in your discussions with the elector as part of your campaign and residents, it would be helpful just to remind people that there may have been a change to their polling station. They've had letters to their household. There will be messages on poll cards. There will be a communications plan, a social media plan around how we communicate these changes. And that will be something that we will continually do from the notice of election up until polling day. But the message is always good to get across as many times as possible. Adequate signage will be around to advise people where there've been changes. But just to flag that if you are speaking to people, it's good to mention that. So the stations themselves, for those of you that haven't been or are not aware or haven't been involved in this process, they're open from 7 AM till 10 PM. Our particular elections office, we open from 6:30, and that's available till 10 o'clock for any election queries that we have. In terms of candidates and agents and any support that you have, any issues around polling day, around polling stations yourselves, while you're out and visiting the stations, etc. We're around, myself, Zoe, the elections team, and the returning officer team are around for any queries that anybody has. But if it's specifically relating to election finance, we always say that's the one thing that we really can't give advice on. So that would be really where we would passport you to the Electoral Commission to get that information. One of the measures we put in place at polling stations and for polling day is when we get to 10 o'clock at night, if we have a queue in a polling station, we need a mechanism to make sure that as the law states, if anybody's inside or outside the polling station at 10 o'clock, they're entitled to receive a ballot paper. So our mechanism for making sure that we can only give a ballot paper to those that are eligible for one is to introduce our queue ticket system. We've used this now for a few years, and it is effective, and it ensures that only those that are entitled to get a ballot paper do so. So that will be in place for this year. Postal votes at polling stations. Postal votes will be able to be handed into polling stations. They can be, but the specifics around a local election is that they can only hand that postal vote into an area within the ward. Sorry, a polling station within the ward. So if it's within the ward, then they can be delivered to the polling station, and also they can be delivered to our returning officer's office. So Sandwell Council House. There is a post box that we have that's outside the council house. We have a checking process in place that at 10 o'clock that is checked to ensure that if there have been any postal votes that are dropped off, we can make sure that they get to the count venue to be included in the count. In terms of polling day, we'll cover that more in detail around, your campaigning and being around polling stations and what your agents can do in polling stations. We'll cover that in more detail when we do our post-nominations briefings following the close of nominations. Okay, the verification and count. So anybody that was involved last year will be aware that we held our election count at Sandwell Valley with the use of a marquee to ensure we could meet our COVID safety requirements and have adequate space for social distancing. This year, we were returning to our original count venue, which is Tipton Sports Academy. And our approach, as I've mentioned, in terms of the count will be to be staying safe. There will be the usual application of the numbers of observers that are allowed to attend the count. And again, we will formalise that in more detail at our subsequent briefing when we know how many candidates that we have for the election. There's no requirements for social distancing, and we won't be using safety screens this time. But what we would ask candidates and agents and any counting agents to do is be mindful of the, when they are observing count tables, to be aware of the situation that we're in around COVID and try and keep people as safe as possible. We will conduct that verification and count following the close of polling stations. So immediately following the close of poll, presiding officers will head to Tipton, be dropping off their ballot boxes, and then we'll proceed to verify those votes and count them. The specifics around the verification and count procedures we'll cover at the post-nomination briefing following this one. Spending issues. So in terms of spending issues, we'll cover this just briefly. Excuse me. Your candidate's expenses are those defined that you use for your campaign. Now, there is a date that applies from, and that's the 29th of March. Sorry, Zoe, would you just be able to carry on this slide? Because I think I'm just going to cough.
Yeah, sure. So yes, your candidate's expenses, so from the 29th of March, you will need to keep a record of any expenses that you have in relation to your campaign. It's everything that you spend that's part of your campaign. The election expenses is actually the responsibility of the election agent, so they are responsible for paying invoices, making those payments, keeping the invoices and receipts that are over £20, and then submitting the expenses after the election. There is a limit on what you can spend, and this all depends on how many electors are registered in the ward that you're standing in. Now, on our website, we have put a list of we've got a table of all the registered electors in each ward, which should help you calculate that. But the basis is it's £806 plus 7 pence per elector in the ward. After this briefing, I will circulate those figures as well, which will help you calculate those figures. So your expenses returns are due 35 calendar days after the result of the election, and they need to be submitted to the return officer, so to us. It's really, really important that they are a legal document. It's really important that they are submitted to us on time. We will remind you in the run-up to the deadline, which is the 9th of June, we'll remind you of the need to submit those to us. And we will also, if there aren't any, if a candidate or election agent do not submit an expense return to us by the deadline, we can refer that to the Electoral Commission and to the police. It is a criminal offence not to submit an expenses return. I think it's occasionally some elections, some candidates and election agents can be a little bit confused by the term of if you're submitting a set of election expenses. These are not what you've paid out, your expenses will not be reimbursed. It's just an account of what you have spent. Yeah, so we may be requested by the Electoral Commission to provide a sample of the returns. So it's really important that you do submit them to us by the deadline of the 9th of June.
Thanks, Zoe.
You okay?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so just some key points then before we get on to any questions that we had. Just want to reiterate that it is your responsibility as a candidate to submit your nomination papers and to ensure that they're submitted in accordance with the law. It's really important to remember, and we will go into this in more detail at the next briefing, but nomination papers will be available from inspection. So from the 6th of April 2022 until the 4th of May, they will be available for inspection. Now, if there are any issues arising from any inspection of a nomination paper, nothing can be challenged until after the election, but they can still be inspected. Please refer to the EC guidance, as we've mentioned. We're here to give you as much kind of support in terms of advice in your pre-checks, in your informal checks. Please make use of those because that's one of the tools that you can use to make sure that this process that you go through is correct. The code of conduct for campaigners and what comes with that. Please ensure that you, again, I know we've reiterated this lots of time, but it's vital that you're fully aware of the implications around that. The nomination paper to be informally checked allow enough time to do that. Now, what we will do is, and just to give you kind of an example, if we were to receive a nomination paper, that was delivered to us a minute before 4 o'clock, then that nomination paper wouldn't essentially have enough time to have that informal check. So what we do on the last day of nominations is we have a cut-off date for the informal check process so we can ensure that's clear and consistent for every single candidate and agent, that they're aware of that, so that there's no confusion as to how that process is going to work on the run-up to the deadline to nominations. Around your nomination papers, again, and just submitting them, I've said this previously, false statements on nomination papers, they are criminal offences. And as with that, what does come with that criminal offence around that can be an unlimited fine, and it can be up to 12 months in prison as well. And I appreciate, that this is, that can sound quite dramatic, but it's important for candidates and agents to be aware of the implications around this. So that's why we do these briefings. That's why we want to offer as much information to you as possible to help you ensure that this is right. We will issue all of this information, the essential links, the slides, and that will all be sent out to you to assist you. We've got some key contacts that we've listed on this slide just to help you. Myself and Zoe and the returning officer team are available to support you, answer any questions that you have. You can speak to ourselves, you can speak to our office. I've got a contact number on there for the West Midlands Police, the SPOC, but as I say, hopefully following the next briefing, they'll be here for you to be able to ask any questions if you've got any concerns of those. So that concludes our briefing in that sense. I've got a slide here which details what we will be covering in more detail at the following briefings and the dates of those briefings. I think that leaves us just to look at any questions, and Zoe will cover any questions that anybody's got. And then we have got our feedback form that will be sent out to you, which is our digital feedback form, which we'd ask you to complete, because what we want to do is look at how we can support you in doing this process as best as possible. So any feedback around this briefing would be really welcomed. So with that, I'll leave that and ask Zoe if we want to go through any questions.
Yep, so we've had a few questions. They all relate to agents. So the first one is, how many counting agents can a candidate have? Now, we won't know that. We won't be able to calculate that until we know how many candidates we have. So we can calculate that after the close of nominations. Because we have to work out how many counting agents a candidate can have based on the number of candidates and the number of staff, accounting staff that we employ. So obviously we won't know that until the close of nominations, and we will obviously share that with you as soon as we know that after the close of nominations, and in the next briefings, the post-nomination briefings, we can share that with you. Another question: where the election agents should be registered, are the counting agents the same? So yes, so the election agents, they need to be appointed as a formal document within your nomination pack. That needs to be submitted by the deadline for nominations. So 4 o'clock on the 5th of April, that needs to be submitted. Counting agents, as I've just said, you won't know how many you're allowed to appoint until after the deadline for nominations. And we will provide forms for those as well after, as I say, after the close of nominations. But yes, you will need to fill in a form for those, and there is a deadline for getting those to us, which is the 28th of April. So that obviously then we have then time to be able to contact those counting agents and provide them with tickets and passes to get into the count venue. Next question: does the witness who signs the home address form and the consent to nomination form have to be from your 10 signatures, your 10 subscribers, or can it be a new person? Can this person be your election agent? So anybody, it doesn't matter who, it doesn't have to be a registered elector, it doesn't have to be anybody of your any of your 10 subscribers. It can be anybody can sign your consent to nomination, and then obviously their details have to go on the home address form. So it can be absolutely anybody. It can be your election agent if you want it to. Most of the time it is the election agent, the details that go on there, but it's entirely up to you. It can be anybody. There's no rules as to who can or can't sign that consent to nomination. Next question is, again, do the election agents need to be registered before the election day? If it is, what's the deadline? So as I've just said, election agents obviously need to be appointed by the close of nominations, which is the 4 o'clock on the 5th of April. All other agents, so your counting agents, your polling agents, and postal vote agents, the deadline for that is the 28th of April. And yes, you do need to complete the separate forms for those, which we'll provide you with at a later date. And then the final question is a repeat of that form question. So that's it in terms of questions that have come through to the chat box. I will say, if you, after this briefing, if you do then have any more further questions, obviously you have both mine and Tracy's email addresses, phone numbers, then just contact us, and we're happy to provide any further information or clarify anything that you're not sure of.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you for everybody that attends this evening. I hope you found it useful and help you, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thank you.